Good morning and welcome into the Hook 'em Hoops podcast. And what an amazing, just what a blessing it is to be doing this show this week, previewing an NCAA tournament game. Yes, it's a first four game, but Texas is alive. They're alive and well. They're playing in the NCAA tournament against the Xavier Musketeers in Dayton. Tommy, your thoughts on this matchup and the fact that Texas made the tournament?
Well, to be honest with you, Jason, I was pretty surprised when Texas came flying across my screen. I saw North Carolina get in. I was like, all right, this is wraps. Great season. We're gonna have to have some discussions here going forward. And sure enough, Texas makes the tournament. I don't know what I think they deserve to be in 100%. I just didn't see the rationale behind putting North Carolina in and putting Texas. And I think if anything, it should have been Texas and then. You look at a team like Indiana or Boise State that maybe could have had a better chance.
West
You
Virginia.
and West Virginia exactly, and I think their governor had a pretty clear stance about that. Um, that's so soft, by the way. I hate every bit of that. Anyways, but no, I think that you look at one of those schools and I think that they had a better resume than North Carolina, but at the end of the day, I'm sure there's politicking and the like that goes on behind the scenes there with their chair. I know he's not in the room, but you can't convince me that there's not some sort of conversations there regardless. Anyways, Texas is in. That's all that matters to me. I could care less about any of the rest of that stuff. You can send your governors and lawsuits and whatever. I don't care. Texas is in. I think this is a good matchup for them. It's an Xavier team that we're very familiar with from a couple of years ago. Not as many pieces there, but Sean Miller is still there. And Jason, you and I were talking about him a little bit before we got on air here, just because of the interesting dynamic of, potential future, whatever the future looks like for Texas men's basketball. If that future does not involve Rodney Terry, which up to this point it should involve Rodney Terry because he's got into the tournament 3 straight years, and you can talk about how odd this team has played all year, all you want. Like he got into the tournament and they won when they needed to win. Um, but if he is dismissed or whatever you want to say, could Sean Miller be the man to be hired at Texas? Every time job openings come up, his name is circulated. So, yeah, something to keep an eye on, but I won't blabber on too much longer. It's a good matchup. I like it for Texas, and it should be a pretty entertaining and fun first four game.
The interesting thing with the Sean Miller connection for me is like I've always perceived that connection to be that Sean Miller is more interested in Texas than Texas is in Sean Miller.
Yeah,
Because
I think
if
there's a degree of relevancy to that. I think there's a degree of accuracy to that.
I think if Texas wanted Sean Miller to be their head coach, it would have happened years ago, and it hasn't. And so I don't think he'd be their top choice. I think he'd maybe be somebody who they'd give a call to, but it creates an interesting dynamic, right? Before I get into more of the nitty gritty of the game, like if Texas beat Xavier, they beat Rodney Terry would beat Sean Miller head to head. If they beat Illinois in the round of 64, that would be another head to head win. Rodney Terry against Brad Underwood. And those are two guys who Texas would certainly call if that job becomes open. And it would create a really interesting dynamic of the optics of hiring a coach who, yes, would be better for the long term of the program, but how do you sell that to the casual fan, the casual alumni who maybe has deep pockets? Hey, here's this coach who our old coach that we just fired just beat. Here's why he's going to build this program up. It creates a really
Right.
interesting situation. But Texas is always going to try to win these games. Texas fans should always want them to win these games. So let's not get into any of the, oh, it'd be better for them to lose, in the round of 32. No, 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 no. They're in. They're in. They're alive. We want them to stay alive as long as possible. Now, their first opponent is Xavier. Tough, tough situation playing them in Dayton. Okay.
Yeah.
Xavier's campus is an hour away from Dayton. So that's going to be a road game. We know the Texas fans don't travel for basketball, at least for men's. This is a good Xavier team that has height and has guards who can score in different ways. Defensively, they're not great. And so I see an opening for Trey Johnson to have a pretty big game. I see the potential for Jordan Pope to carry over some of the good games that he had in Nashville. And I think Arthur Kaluma, man, if there's any time for him to really start scoring the basketball, like I know he can, like he did at K-State last year, like he did at Creighton at times, it's this week, starting in Dayton, because Zach Fremantle's a great offensive player. Defensively, I think he's a pretty trash. So I think that Arthur Kaluma could be able to, I mean, have a pretty good game. He looked pretty good. At least, I mean, he was playing really hard in Nashville, which you love to see out of a fifth year senior like that. So it's a pretty even matchup in terms of the personnel. Xavier can go a little deeper than Texas. Let's see. They've got really nine guys who play. Texas has nine guys who can play too, but I think Xavier's a deeper team overall when you put those rosters up together. Who do you think for Texas needs to show up the most? I've kind of pitched my tent in the Arthur Kaluma side of things. What do you think?
I mean, it's kind of like the obvious answer for all these games, but it needs to be Trey Johnson. Like there have been so many games this season where he is the basically the sole reason they are either competing or they are winning games. And if they want to win in March, then he needs to be elite. He needs to be elite, and I think he is. But there are some games, you look at the last game of the season where he goes 0 for 14 from the field, and it's just, oh my God, like he can't buy a bucket. And I'm not saying he has to go out and score 40 points like he did, the other day when they still lost. But he needs to go and be Trey Johnson, and I think that the supporting cast around him is just as important because. Now we've seen what Texas looks like when, Tremont Mark steps up, when Caden Shedrick, believe it or not, steps up, when Jordan Pope steps up. And, you're absolutely hit the nail on the head with Arthur Kaluma. That's another guy. But Jason, I think what has completely changed the outlook of this season for me, and we've talked about it a little bit on the pod, but moving Tremont Mark to point guard was the best
Mm,
thing that Rodney Terry's done, and it might be the best thing that Rodney Terry's ever done in his time at
mm,
Texas. That
yeah.
is what needed to be the case all along. And I know he hasn't been healthy, but that's what needed to be the case all along. He can get his shot, but he's not an ISO ball player. And there was just so much ISO ball saturated on early in the year with Texas that it just didn't work. And now that he's kind of facilitating and moving things around and getting guys open looks, I think it's going to be much better for it. And the other part of it too is Kendall Weaver's back and healthy. I mean,
Mm.
he's coming off the bench and giving everybody a spark. There, he has his chaotic moments where you kind of just throw your hands up and you're like, "What are you doing?" But then you also have the moments where you look at yourself and say, "Well, how did he end up with the steal there? How did he get up for that block?" So those two things have completely changed the game. So along with Trey Johnson being Trey Johnson, if those things stay the same, where Tremont Mark's able to completely run the offense and Kendall Weaver does what Kendall Weaver does for you, especially on the defensive side of the floor, then I think Texas is setting themselves up not just in this first four game, but if they win it pretty well in the round of 64 against Illinois too.
Yeah, and that game would get a separate podcast. But what I will say is that would be a fantastic matchup for Texas. Like if they win this game against Xavier, there's a very clear path to the round of 32, and that would give them their easiest second round opponent when they're like a lower seeded team in a very long time. They had Purdue a couple of years ago. They had Tennessee last year. Those weren't games that they were going to win. Kentucky, they can beat. Kentucky, they beat, not too long ago with the exact same players who are going to be playing in this game. I think, you bring up Tremont Marcus point guard now. His defensive game is really important in this game because he's going to be guarding Davion McKnight, who is the facilitator for Xavier. And there's a 5-inch height differential there. If Tremont Mark can really lock down Davion McKnight, cut off some of those passing lanes, open things up maybe for Kendall Weaver, Texas is going to have their way defensively. The other thing that I really like about this matchup, Xavier is built a lot like Vanderbilt, and Texas handled Vanderbilt last week. Texas controlled that game for 40 minutes. If Texas comes out and plays the same way they did against Vanderbilt, they probably win this game. Shut down the scoring guards. Yes, the forwards are going to kind of have their ways. Like Jason Edwards, the little guard for Vanderbilt, he still had a good game, and Tyler Nickel, the forward, he played pretty well. But other than that, Texas really shut down their bench, shut down their guards, didn't let them terrorize and operate in transition. And if Texas is able to execute that same game plan on Wednesday night in Dayton, they're probably going to win. And they handled Xavier 2 years ago. Yes, it's a pretty different team. There are some similar pieces. I think Jerome Hunter is one guy who was on that team 2 years ago and is on this year's Xavier team. But I'm really excited to see what Texas is able to do. Just to have an opportunity to play is exciting. I'm excited about this for Trey Johnson. I'm excited about this for Julian Larry and Jason Kent being seniors and Tremont Mark and Caden Shedrick. That's my last point. Caden Shedrick, he needs to have a big game.
I'm just gonna laugh. I won't say anything. I'm just gonna laugh.
He's like the
Um,
laughing stock of the team now, which is like kind of crazy because I
I'll,
thought he played pretty good in Nashville.
I'll give him
And the
this. He
casuals
played. He played. I'm with you. He played well against Tennessee. I mean, he played well against Tennessee,
like
but
good against Vanderbilt too. I thought the casuals on Texas Twitter were a little too hard on him. Like he's just the type of player who's like gonna have some of those moments like where you're yelling at your TV, like, what the heck are you doing? But at the end of the day, like he's a pretty good center. I mean, he holds his own against most SEC bigs. And in games like this one on Wednesday against Xavier, where they have the clear height advantage, Caden Shedrick's going to be really important. For me, he just has to play physical. And that's always been the big question with him. Usually when he plays physical, he fouls out. And so if Caden Shedrick can play physical and controlled, I'm going to gulp before I say this, but Texas will win if Caden Shedrick.
that's a big if because I don't think he is all that physical. There have been so many times this year where it just seems like, and I'm not in the business of calling people soft. I don't think he's soft, but it's just like where like for a guy his stature and the way that he's building the height advantages he has, there are some rebounds that come down where you're like, okay, you had a chance at that. Like if you just exert a little bit more effort. Now I'm not saying he doesn't give effort, you can get that bored, and it's just so many different things with him that have been frustrating to watch this year. But you're right. I mean, when he's playing well, he's a good SEC center, and I think he played well against Vanderbilt. He played well against Tennessee. Played well against A&M. Can that carry into March? I mean, that's all that matters. He can. If he proves me wrong, awesome, fantastic. I will come on this show before Texas plays Illinois and apologize. But I just don't think that if you are banking on Caden Shedrick to win you a game, that it's going to happen. I just don't think he's that kind of
Uh,
player. I don't think he's that kind of difference maker. That's why you need a Trey Johnson, who is a bona fide difference maker and can
mm,
change every single game that you play in to have a big game, because that's what Texas is going to need, not just in this game, but if they want to make a run in March, which I don't know if we want to talk too much in depth about this. I think they can if they get to the round of 64. I think they got a pretty
we
favorable
can talk
draw.
about that. I think they can.
Um, then yeah, okay, then we'll talk about that. Texas got a really favorable draw if they win this game.
Mm,
Like
very.
very favorable. Illinois, I'm not saying they're a bad team, but when you look at the rest of the bracket, they're a beatable team, especially for Texas. I think that, this is where there's 14 SEC teams in the tournament. If the SEC wants to be like, this is why we put in 14 teams, then that's your chance to show them like, hey, this is the best conference in college basketball. And then in all likelihood after that, it'll be Kentucky, unless Troy does everybody a favor and knocks Kentucky out. Like we talked about earlier, Texas has beaten Kentucky this year. It was at home and it was only by 4 points, but is Lamont Butler fully healthy? Is Jackson Robinson fully healthy for Kentucky?
Yeah.
Those are all big questions. And if they're not healthy, obviously we hope that's not the case. But if they're not healthy, it would certainly be advantageous for Texas. And then after that is where the road stops because it's Tennessee, probably. But Rick Barnes has not been great in March, so could Texas be the one to where he kind of breaks his curse? With Texas's luck, probably. And I don't want to play Tennessee by any means, but you'll take that. And then the one seed in the region is Houston, so that's definitely where the buck stops, if anything. But I don't think Texas is going to be an Elite Eight team. But if they won 2 games in the tournament, and if this is a Sweet 16 team, I mean, we talked about it when the season started, Jason. I thought that was their ceiling. And it's an attainable ceiling, I feel like. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but it's an attainable ceiling.
I think that this Midwest bracket is chaos. And I think that there's a pretty good chance that after the round of 64, some of the top teams are out. I think Houston obviously is going to survive SIUE and Tennessee is going to survive Wofford because Wofford just wasn't one of the better teams in the SoCon this year. But starting, Kentucky and Troy, that's the smallest spread of all the 3v14 games. And so Kentucky's going to have a target on their back because they lose a game like this every March. I don't think it happens this year, but it could. And then Purdue and High Point, I have High Point beating Purdue. I have McNeese beating Clemson. And then I have, even if Xavier beats Texas, the winner of this game is going to beat Illinois. I want to go on the record and say this. The only downside to that Texas Illinois matchup, and I'm going to try and keep a straight face here, The only downside to Texas playing Illinois is that Texas beating them would likely prevent Brad Underwood from being the next coach. I don't see a way Texas loses this game otherwise. I really don't. I think that every matchup favors them in this game. I think that Kendall Weaver would have Kasparis Yakachonis in hell. I don't think that Illinois is able to shoot to match up with Texas. And yes, Tomislav Ivicic is a pretty good big, but man, I think Trey Johnson would absolutely light up that Illinois defense, absolutely light them up. Um, I got to ask you, how many wins do you think Rodney Terry needs these next few weeks to remain head coach next year?
I think if he makes it to the Sweet 16, he's safe.
I agree. I agree.
Anything worse than that, I don't know. I mean,
I agree. And it's interesting because like if they make the round of 32 and he still gets fired, Chris Del Conte better have a good hire lined up.
they better because, obviously that first year under whoever it is next is going to be incredibly important of,
Mhm.
like, okay, that's because that's the bar. That then becomes the bar for Texas basketball. Chris Del Conte has a tough question to ask himself. What is the bar that you want to set for Texas athletics in basketball? Because if the bar is around at 32 and you don't make it, Rodney Terry's gotten you there twice in the past. So if that's the bar, then you also have to make that commitment, and that means a financial commitment too. And you've got to raise some money for this Texas men's basketball program so they can recruit better. They haven't recruited poorly by any means. Rodney Terry is an ace recruiter. You see that in Trey Johnson, but they've got to recruit better. They can't just get one guy every cycle to be the guy and then just not build around that. I don't think they've done a good enough job of that.
I don't think so either. And we've talked about it a lot on the show, how the next guy who comes in, not to talk too much about, hypothetical situations on a game preview episode, but the next guy who comes in has to recruit Texas better, has to just recruit prep basketball better as a whole. I mean, they have one guy signed in the class of 25, and that's just not going to cut it. Rodney Terry's probably accustomed to rebuilding his roster every year, but it's just not the way that teams are winning national championships. You need some carryover. Texas hasn't had any carryover really the last few years. My prediction for this game, I think Texas wins. I think Rodney Terry's just a good March coach. I think that he steps it up a notch when the calendar turns to the third month of the year. And I think that even though the crowd disadvantage may affect Texas and Xavier has guards who can hit shots, this is a team that is built exactly like a team that Texas beat last week in a very similar situation. Think about it. Vanderbilt playing in Nashville is so similar with it, like when you consider the way that Vanderbilt's built, like it feels like Texas is playing the exact game they played last Wednesday and won. And that's why I'm going to say this Wednesday, they're going to play this game. They're going to win it. They're going to play Illinois on Friday, and they're going to win that too.
Yeah, I'm with you. I won't make an Illinois prediction just because I want to see how they play first, but I do think Texas beats Xavier. I think that this Xavier team has had some good wins throughout the course of the year, but there aren't anywhere I look at and I'm just blown away. And I know that Texas is 7-10 in quad one games, so that's not necessarily a record that blows you away either. But I think this team is battle tested. I agree with you. I think Rodney Terry is better in March, and I think they win this game close. I'll go Texas by 4, but I think we're going to the round of 64.
I hope so too. I hope so too. One last thing about Xavier 1-9 versus quad one. Among those games was an away game against Villanova. So think if Xavier were to have come on the road against Texas, they almost certainly would not have won that game. I mean, they lost at Cincinnati. Yes, it's a rivalry. Their other road losses are pretty good. Villanova and Creighton and UConn and really good teams. This is going to be a great game. I'm excited about it. I'm excited that we got to do another podcast game preview. And I'm really looking forward to seeing Trey Johnson hopefully get his shining moment. And there hopefully will be many more to come after that. Tommy, happy March. Thank you for joining me. To those watching at home, thank you as always. This is a Hook 'em Hoops podcast brought to you by BetMGM in the Field of 68. Have a great rest of your day.